What if Arkham Asylum was never meant to cure anyone, only to contain what cannot be fixed? Behind its locked doors lies more than madness. It holds a pattern that keeps repeating, a cycle that no one has truly broken. The same faces return, the same chaos escapes, and the same silence waits in between. But the most disturbing part isn't what happens inside Arkham, it's how closely it mirrors Gotham itself. Tonight, we are not just exploring villains or crime, we are uncovering a system that may have been broken from the very beginning. And once you see it clearly, one question remains. Is Arkham holding the madness or feeding it? The shape of madness. When people think about Gotham City, they often imagine dark streets, tall buildings, and shadows that seem to stretch longer than they should. But what makes Gotham truly unsettling is not just the crime that happens in it. It is the feeling that something deeper is always there, something quiet and unseen, something that slowly shapes the people who live inside it without them even realizing it. And at the center of all of this stands Batman, not just as a hero who fights crime, but as someone who moves through a world where danger is not always loud, where the real battle is often inside the mind, and where every alley, every building, and every silent moment seems to carry a kind of weight that cannot be easily explained. At first glance, Gotham may look like a city filled with criminals and chaos, where villains rise and fall, and where a masked figure appears to stop them. But if you look closer, if you slow down and pay attention to the details, you begin to notice that the problems of Gotham are not simple, and they are not new, and they are not something that can be solved with a single fight or a single night of justice. Because what lives inside this city is not just crime, but something that feels much older and much deeper, something that changes people over time, slowly and quietly, until they are no longer the same as they once were. This is where the idea of madness begins to take shape, not as something sudden or explosive, but as something that grows little by little, like a shadow that spreads without being noticed. And in Gotham, this kind of change can be seen everywhere, in the way people speak, in the way they act, and in the way they begin to lose the line between what is real and what is not. And this is why Gotham cannot simply be understood as a dangerous place, because it is something more than that, something that feels almost alive, as if it watches and waits, as if it listens, and as if it slowly pulls people towards something they cannot escape. And then there is Arkham Asylum, a place that many believe is meant to help, a place that is supposed to heal those who have lost their way. But in Gotham, Arkham is not just a hospital. It is not just a building with walls and locked doors. It is something much more powerful, something that represents everything the city cannot fix, everything it tries to hide, and everything that continues to return no matter how many times it is pushed away. And when people speak about Arkham, they often speak about the people inside it, the criminals, the villains, the ones who have crossed a line that cannot be undone. But what they do not always see is that Arkham itself has become a symbol, a reflection of the city's deepest problems. Because Arkham does not just hold madness, it reflects it, and in some ways, it even shapes it. And the more you think about it, the more you begin to wonder if Arkham is truly a place of healing at all, or if it is something else entirely, something that simply keeps things contained, something that hides the problem instead of solving it. And this idea becomes even more unsettling when you realize that the same people who are locked inside Arkham often find their way back out, returning to Gotham again and again, as if the cycle never truly ends, as if the city and the asylum are connected in a way that cannot be broken. In this world, madness does not always look the way people expect it to look. It is not always loud or violent. It is not always clear or easy to understand. And sometimes it appears calm, controlled, and even intelligent, hiding behind plans, ideas, and beliefs that seem almost reasonable at first. And this is what makes Gotham so different from other places. Because here, madness is not always something to fear from a distance. Sometimes it stands right in front of you, speaking clearly, thinking deeply, and moving carefully, and this makes it even harder to recognize. And as Batman moves through this world, as he watches and listens and tries to understand what is happening around him, he begins to see something that others often miss. He begins to see that the villains he faces are not just enemies to be stopped. They are reflections of something larger, something that exists not just inside them, but inside the city itself. And this is what makes his role so complicated, because he is not just fighting people, he is facing ideas, fears, and broken parts of the human mind that cannot simply be locked away or defeated. It is also important to understand that Gotham does not seem to create madness in the way people might think. It does not suddenly turn normal people into something else overnight. Instead, it seems to draw in those who are already close to the edge, those who carry something inside them that is waiting to grow, and once they arrive, once they become part of the city, that something begins to take shape, slowly becoming stronger, clearer, and more difficult to control, as if Gotham itself is giving it space to exist. This is why so many of the people who become part of Arkham's story feel like they were always meant to end up there, not because they had no choice, but because the city seemed to guide them in that direction, step by step, moment by moment, until there was nowhere else for them to go. And when they finally cross that line, when they finally become what they were always close to becoming, Arkham is waiting for them, not as a solution, but as a place where the cycle can continue. And the more you think about this, the more unsettling it becomes, because it suggests that the problem is not just inside the people who are locked away, it is also inside the world they come from, inside the streets, the systems, and the silence that surrounds everything. And this raises a question that is difficult to answer, a question that Batman himself seems to carry with him every time he steps into the night. And that question is whether the city can ever truly change, or if it is simply repeating the same story over and over again. There are moments when Gotham feels quiet, when the streets are still and the lights glow softly against the dark sky, and in those moments, it almost feels peaceful, almost normal. But even then, there is something beneath that calm, something waiting, something that has not disappeared but is simply resting. And this is what makes the city so difficult to understand, because it is never just one thing. It is both calm and chaotic, both safe and dangerous, both real and almost unreal at the same time. And in the middle of all of this, Batman continues to move forward, not because he believes the city is simple, but because he understands that it is not, and because he knows that even if the cycle cannot be fully broken, even if Arkham continues to stand as a symbol of everything that cannot be fixed, there is still value in trying, still value in standing against the darkness, even if that darkness never fully goes away. But the deeper truth, the one that slowly reveals itself the more you look, is that Gotham is not just a place where madness exists. It is a place that welcomes it, that gives it room to grow, and that allows it to become something more. And Arkham, standing quietly within it, is not just a response to that madness. It is part of it, a constant reminder that the line between control and chaos is thinner than anyone wants to admit. And as the night stretches on, and as the city continues to breathe in its slow and steady way, the shape of madness becomes clearer, not as something that can be easily seen or easily defined, but as something that is always there, always present, quietly shaping everything, waiting in the shadows, and reminding anyone who dares to look closely that in Gotham, the most dangerous things are not always the ones you can see, but the ones you slowly become. The birth of Arkham Asylum, long before the heavy gates closed and the long halls filled with quiet footsteps and distant echoes. The place that would one day become Arkham Asylum began as something very different, something that was never meant to hold the broken minds of Gotham, but instead stood as a family home, a large and silent mansion tied closely to the life of Amadeus Arkham, a man whose name would slowly become part of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And if you take a moment to picture that mansion in its earliest days, you might imagine wide, empty rooms, tall windows letting in soft light, and quiet evenings where nothing seemed out of place. But even then, there was already something strange about it, something that could not be easily explained, something that felt just a little too still, as if the house itself was waiting for a story to unfold inside it. Amadeus Arkham was not a simple man, and his life was not shaped by simple events, because from the very beginning, he carried a deep interest in the human mind, in the way people think, in the way they feel, and in the way those thoughts and feelings can change over time. And this interest slowly grew into something stronger, something that began to guide his choices and shape his future, leading him down a path where understanding the mind became more than just a goal. It became an obsession, something he could not let go of, even when it began to affect the way he saw the world around him. At first, his work seemed meaningful, even helpful, because he believed that people who struggled with their thoughts and emotions could be helped, that they could be guided back to a place of calm and clarity. And this belief became the reason why the mansion was no longer just a home, because Amadeus began to imagine something else for it, something larger, something that could serve a purpose beyond his own life. And so the idea of turning it into a place for treatment slowly took shape, not all at once, but through small decisions, quiet plans, and a growing feeling that this was what the house was meant to become. But the change from home to institution was not a clean or peaceful one, because it did not come from a place of calm thinking or careful planning alone. It came from something deeper, something painful, something that began to grow inside Amadeus after a terrible event that would shape everything that followed. And that event was the loss of his family, a moment so heavy and so sudden that it changed the way he saw everything, turning his understanding of the human mind into something darker, something more urgent, and something that no longer felt like a choice, but like a need. The mansion, once filled with the quiet presence of his loved ones, became something else entirely, because every room began to carry memories that could not be escaped. Every hallway became a reminder of what had been lost, and instead of leaving that place behind, instead of walking away and starting again somewhere new, Amadeus chose to stay, to remain inside those walls, and to reshape them into something that he believed could give meaning to his pain. And this is where the transformation truly began, not as a hopeful project, but as something built on grief, something shaped by loss, and something that would carry that feeling forward into everything it became. As the mansion slowly changed, as its rooms were altered and its purpose redefined, the atmosphere inside it also began to shift, becoming heavier, quieter, and more unsettling, even if no one could fully explain why. And while it was now being called a place for healing, a place for helping those who had lost control of their thoughts, there were already signs that something was not quite right, that something about this place did not match the purpose it was meant to serve. And these signs were not always loud or obvious, but they were there, hidden in the way people felt when they stepped inside, in the way the air seemed to press down just a little too much, and in the way silence seemed to linger longer than it should. Amadeus continued his work, continuing to bring people into the mansion, continuing to study them, observe them, and try to understand what had led them to where they were. But as time passed, it became harder to separate his work from his own thoughts, harder to tell where his role as a doctor ended and where his own struggles began. And this is where the line between healer and patient slowly started to blur, not in a sudden way, but in a quiet and gradual way, where small changes began to add up, where small moments began to carry more weight, and where the sense of control he once had began to slip. There is something important to notice here, something that is easy to miss if you only look at the surface, and that is the idea that Arkham Asylum, even in its earliest form, was not created from a place of balance or peace. It was created from a place of pain, from a mind that was already beginning to struggle. And because of this, the foundation of Arkham was never stable, never fully grounded, and never truly ready to support the kind of healing it claimed to offer. And this is what makes its story so unsettling, because it suggests that from the very beginning, Arkham was not designed to fix what was broken, but to hold it, to contain it, and perhaps even to reflect it. As more patients were brought into the mansion, as more stories filled its halls, the feeling that something was wrong became harder to ignore, even if no one could clearly explain it. And while there were moments where it seemed like progress was being made, where it seemed like people were being helped, those moments were often followed by something else, something that pulled everything back into uncertainty. And this pattern began to repeat, slowly creating a sense that the place itself was not moving forward, but standing still, caught in a loop that could not be broken. And in the middle of all of this, Amadeus Arkham remained at the center, continuing his work, continuing his studies, but also continuing to change in ways that were not always visible from the outside, because the same curiosity that once drove him to help others had now become something heavier, something that pushed him deeper into the very thing he was trying to understand. And this created a kind of tension within the walls of the mansion, a feeling that the person in charge was no longer fully separate from the problem he was trying to solve. The more time passed, the clearer it became that Arkham was not just a place where people were treated. It was a place where something deeper was happening, something that could not be easily measured or explained. And this idea becomes even more powerful when you realize that many of the people who entered Arkham did not leave in a way that suggested healing, but in ways that raised more questions, more concerns, and more uncertainty about what was really happening inside those walls. It is in these early moments, in these quiet beginnings, that the true nature of Arkham begins to reveal itself, not through loud events or clear signs, but through a slow and steady build of something that feels wrong, something that does not match the purpose it claims to serve. And this is what makes its story so important to understand, because it shows that Arkham was never simply a place that became corrupted over time. It was a place that may have carried that corruption from the very start. And when you step back and look at the full picture, when you consider the life of Amadeus Arkham, the loss he experienced, the choices he made, and the way the mansion was transformed into something else, it becomes difficult to ignore the idea that Arkham Asylum was never truly meant to heal, not in the way people hoped it would, but instead was shaped into something that holds, reflects, and even deepens the very thing it was created to fight against. In the end, the birth of Arkham is not a story about a place being built to help people. It is a story about how pain can shape something into a form that looks helpful on the surface, but carries something much heavier underneath. And as that story continues, as more people enter its halls and become part of its history, that quiet and unsettling feeling only grows stronger, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous places are not the ones that look broken, but the ones that were built that way from the very beginning. A house built on trauma. There are some places that feel quiet in a way that is calm and peaceful, but there are also places where the quiet feels heavy, where it seems to press against you, where it carries something you cannot see but can still feel. And the mansion that would later become Arkham Asylum slowly became that kind of place, not because of its size or its design, but because of what happened inside it, because of the moments that shaped it, and because of the man at the center of it all, Amadeus Arkham, whose life did not simply change one day, but instead slowly shifted after something so painful that it left a mark on everything that followed. Before the tragedy, before the silence became something else, the mansion had been a home, a place where life moved in simple and familiar ways, where voices filled the rooms and where time seemed to pass without leaving behind anything heavy or difficult. But that kind of life can sometimes feel far away when something sudden and terrible happens. And for Amadeus Arkham, that moment came in a way that no one could prepare for, a moment that did not just take something from him, but changed the way he saw everything, turning what was once normal into something distant and unreachable. The loss of his family was not just an event, it was something that stayed with him, something that did not fade or soften with time, and instead became a part of the way he thought, the way he moved, and the way he understood the world. And when you imagine what that must have been like, You can begin to understand how a person might try to find meaning in something so painful, how they might try to make sense of something that feels impossible to explain. And this is where the idea of turning the mansion into something more than a home begins to take shape again. But now, it is no longer just about helping others. It is about trying to understand what cannot be understood, trying to control something that feels out of control. As the days passed and the mansion remained filled with memories that could not be escaped, Amadeus chose not to leave, chose not to walk away from the place that reminded him of everything he had lost, and instead, he stayed, and in staying, he began to change the meaning of that space, slowly turning it into something that reflected his own thoughts and feelings, something that carried his grief in every room, in every hallway, and in every quiet moment that stretched longer than it should. At first, his work may have seemed like a way to cope, a way to focus his mind on something that could be studied, something that could be observed and understood. And this is where the idea of helping those with troubled minds became even more important to him, because if he could understand them, if he could learn how their thoughts worked, then maybe he could also understand his own. Maybe he could find a way to bring order to the chaos that now lived inside him. And this belief pushed him forward, guiding him deeper into his work. Even as the line between his purpose and his pain became harder to see, there is something very quiet but very important that happens here, something that does not appear all at once, but grows slowly over time. And that is the way Amadeus begins to lose the distance between himself and the people he is trying to help. Because when someone studies something for too long, when they spend too much time inside it, they begin to change in ways they may not notice. And in this case, the thing he was studying was the human mind, under stress, under fear, under loss. And those were the very things he was now experiencing himself. As more patients entered the mansion, as more voices filled the halls, the place began to feel less like a home and less like a place of healing, and more like something in between, something that could not fully decide what it was meant to be. And this created a kind of tension that could be felt even if it could not be clearly described, because the people inside were not just being cared for, they were being observed, studied, and in some ways, mirrored by the man who was meant to guide them. The murder of his family became more than just a memory. It became the emotional center of everything, the reason behind every decision, the weight behind every action. And as time went on, it became clear that this event was not something that had been left behind, but something that continued to shape the present, something that influenced the way Amadeus saw his patients, the way he approached his work, and the way he understood the idea of madness itself. In a way, the mansion became a reflection of his mind, not in a direct or obvious way, but in the feeling it carried, in the way it held on to things, in the way it did not let go. And this is what makes the story of Arkham so unsettling, because it suggests that the place was not just shaped by design or purpose, but by emotion, by pain, and by a mind that was already beginning to struggle under the weight of something it could not escape. And as this continued, as the work went on, and the patients remained within those walls, something else began to happen, something that is difficult to notice unless you are looking closely. And that is the way the roles within the mansion began to shift, not suddenly, but slowly, where the difference between caretaker and patient became less clear, where the person in charge was no longer fully separate from the people he was treating, and where control began to feel uncertain. Amadeus Arkham was still seen as the one guiding the work, the one leading the effort to understand and help, but inside, something had already begun to change. Something that made his thoughts less stable, less certain, and more influenced by the very things he was trying to study. And this created a situation where the person meant to bring clarity was now surrounded by confusion, where the person meant to offer stability was now carrying instability within himself. This is not something that can be seen in a single moment, not something that can be pointed to and clearly defined. But it is something that can be felt when you consider the full picture, when you imagine a place where the person in charge is slowly becoming part of the problem, where the lines between roles are fading, and where the structure that is meant to hold everything together is no longer as strong as it once was. And in this environment, in this space where grief, study, and uncertainty all exist together, Arkham begins to take on a new meaning, not just as a place where people go when they are unwell, but as a place where the idea of being well and unwell begins to lose its clear boundaries, where those definitions become harder to hold on to, and where the question of who is helping and who needs help becomes more complicated than anyone expected. The longer this continues, the more the mansion feels like it is holding something that cannot be easily contained, something that grows not just in the people inside it, but in the space itself, in the atmosphere, in the silence that stretches between words. And this is what makes Arkham different from other places, because it does not simply house madness, it lives alongside it, shaped by it, influenced by it, and unable to fully separate from it. And when you step back and look at how it all began, when you think about the loss that started it, the choices that followed, and the way those choices slowly built something larger than anyone intended, it becomes clear that Arkham was never just a place created to help others. It was a place built on something deeply personal, something deeply painful, and because of that, it carries that pain forward into everything it becomes. In the end, the story of this house is not just about walls and rooms or patients and doctors. It is about how one moment, one event, can change the direction of everything, how it can shape a place, a purpose, and a future in ways that are not always visible at first, and how that change can slowly blur the lines between roles, between identities, and between what is meant to be safe and what is not. And as the mansion stands, quiet and still, holding all of these stories within it, it becomes more than just a building. It becomes a reminder that some places are not just built from plans and ideas, but from emotions, from loss, and from the kind of experiences that do not fade, but remain, shaping everything that comes after. And in that sense, Arkham was never just a house. It was always something more, something that carried its origin with it, and something that would continue to reflect that origin in every life that entered its doors. The first patient. When a place is first opened with a purpose, there is often a quiet hope that things will begin in a calm and controlled way, that the people who enter will be guided carefully, and that whatever happens inside those walls will follow a plan that makes sense. But Arkham was never that kind of place, and from the very beginning, even in its earliest days, there was already a feeling that something was off, something that could not be fully explained. And that feeling became clearer when the first patient was brought inside, a man named Martin Hawkins, whose presence would mark the start of something much darker than anyone expected. Martin Hawkins was not just another man in need of help, not just someone who had lost control and needed guidance, because the story of how he arrived at the mansion already carried a kind of weight, a kind of violence that did not belong in a place meant for healing. And when you imagine him stepping through those doors for the first time, you can almost feel how the atmosphere shifts, how the quiet of the mansion becomes something else, something tighter, something heavier, as if the building itself recognizes that something important is beginning. He was brought in as a patient, as someone who needed to be observed and treated, and on the surface, this may have seemed like a normal step for a place that was meant to study and understand troubled minds. But there was something about Martin that made him different. Something about the way his story connected to the pain that already lived inside the walls. And this connection was not just a small detail, it was something that tied him directly to the life of Amadeus Arkham, creating a link between the man running the institution and the man who had now become its first patient. This connection is what makes his role so important, because Martin Hawkins was not just a starting point, he was a symbol, a reflection of the very thing that had shaped Arkham's creation. And by bringing him into the mansion, it was almost as if the past had been invited inside, as if the pain that had already taken root was now being given a form, a voice, and a presence that could not be ignored. From the moment he entered, there was already a sense that the purpose of Arkham was being tested, that the idea of healing was being challenged in a way that no one had prepared for. because instead of bringing calm or understanding, Martin brought something else, something that did not settle or soften, but instead stirred the space around him, making the quiet halls feel less stable, less certain, and more alive with tension. Violence, which had once existed outside those walls, had now crossed the threshold, and this is a very important moment to understand, because it shows that Arkham was never able to keep itself separate from the world beyond it. It was never able to create a clear boundary between what was inside and what was outside. And once that boundary was broken, even in this early stage, it became much harder to restore. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that a place meant to contain danger is touched by that danger from the very beginning, because it suggests that the foundation itself is not strong, that the purpose itself may not be as clear as it should be. And in Arkham's case, this early moment set a pattern, a quiet but powerful pattern that would repeat again and again in the years that followed. As Martin Hawkins settled into his place within the mansion, as he became part of its daily life, it became clear that he was not simply being held there, he was becoming part of it. And this is where the idea of Arkham begins to shift, from being a place that holds people to being a place that absorbs them. And this change is not something that happens all at once, but something that grows slowly, something that can only be seen when you look closely at how people change over time. The people inside Arkham do not remain the same as they were when they arrived, and while this might be expected in a place of treatment, where change is meant to lead toward healing, in Arkham, the change feels different. It feels less like progress and more like transformation into something else, something that is shaped by the environment rather than guided away from it. Martin Hawkins becomes one of the first examples of this, not just in the way he behaves, but in the way his presence begins to affect everything around him. Because when someone carries violence within them, when their story is built on something that has already crossed a line, that presence does not stay contained. It spreads in quiet ways, influencing the mood, the energy, and even the thoughts of those nearby. And as Amadeus Arkham continues his work, continues to observe and study, there is a growing sense that he is not just watching Martin, but also being drawn into the same space, the same emotional weight, the same confusion between understanding and being affected. And this is where the line between observer and participant begins to blur once again, not in a clear or obvious way, but in a subtle and gradual way that becomes harder to notice as time passes. The mansion itself begins to feel different, not just because of the people inside it, but because of the way those people interact with the space, because of the way their thoughts, their fears, and their actions seem to settle into the walls, into the floors, and into the very air, creating a kind of presence that lingers even when nothing is happening, even when everything appears calm. This is where the idea that Arkham absorbs people becomes more than just a thought. It becomes something that can be felt, something that seems to grow stronger with each new person who enters, with each new story that becomes part of its history. And this creates a kind of cycle where the place influences the people, and the people, in turn, shape the place, making it harder and harder to separate one from the other. And when you think about how this all began, how the very first patient brought with him a connection to violence, a connection to the past, and a presence that did not fit within the idea of healing, it becomes clear that Arkham was never given the chance to start clean. It was never allowed to grow into something stable, because from the very beginning, it was already carrying something heavy, something that would continue to shape it in ways that could not be undone. There is also something important to understand about how people inside Arkham are seen, because over time, they are no longer just individuals with their own stories. They become part of something larger, part of a system, part of a pattern. And this can make it easier to forget that each of them arrived with their own past, their own experiences, and their own reasons for being there. But in a place like Arkham, those details begin to blur, replaced by roles, by labels, and by the quiet expectation that they will remain part of that space. Martin Hawkins, as the first patient, stands at the beginning of this pattern, not just as a person, but as a sign of what Arkham would become, because his presence marks the moment when the idea of healing begins to shift into something else, something less certain, something that feels more like containment than recovery, and more like reflection than resolution. And as the days pass, as the mansion continues to hold its growing number of patients, the early signs of what Arkham truly is become harder to ignore, even if they are not fully understood, because the place does not simply hold madness, it seems to echo it, to carry it forward, and to make it part of its identity. In the end, the arrival of the first patient is not just a moment in time, it is the beginning of a pattern that shows how Arkham does not stand apart from the people inside it, but instead becomes connected to them in a way that is difficult to break, and this connection, once formed, continues to grow, shaping everything that comes after, and reminding us that from the very start, Arkham was never just a place of healing, but something much more complicated, something that does not simply contain what enters it, but slowly becomes part of it. The living architecture. When people first hear about Arkham, they often imagine a large building with tall walls, locked doors, and narrow windows. A place that simply exists to keep dangerous people inside and the rest of the city safe. But the truth is much harder to understand, because Arkham does not feel like just a building, and it does not behave like one either. And the longer someone spends inside it, the more they begin to notice that it seems to carry a presence, a kind of quiet awareness that cannot be easily explained, as if the structure itself is not just standing there, but watching, listening, and slowly reacting to everything that happens within its walls. At first, this feeling may be easy to ignore, because when someone enters Arkham for the first time, they are often focused on the obvious things: the heavy doors, the long corridors, the sound of footsteps echoing across the floor, and the distant voices that seem to come from nowhere. But as time passes, as those same sights and sounds repeat again and again, something begins to change, and that change does not happen in the building itself, but in the way people experience it, in the way it begins to feel less like a place and more like something that surrounds them completely. The corridors are one of the first things that stand out, because they seem to stretch farther than expected, turning again and again in ways that make it difficult to remember where you started. And even though the layout may not actually change, it often feels like it does, as if the paths are shifting slightly, just enough to create doubt, just enough to make a person question their own sense of direction. And this kind of uncertainty can grow quickly, especially in a place where everything already feels heavy and closed off. There are moments when someone may walk down the same hallway they have walked many times before, yet something about it feels different. Maybe the light seems dimmer, maybe the walls feel closer, or maybe the silence seems deeper, and while these changes may be small, they begin to add up, slowly creating a sense that the building is not fixed, not stable, but instead always slightly changing in ways that are hard to explain and even harder to trust. This is where the idea of Arkham as a living space begins to take shape, not because it moves in obvious ways, but because it creates an experience that feels active, that feels like it is responding to the people inside it. And this feeling becomes stronger the longer someone stays, because repetition does not bring comfort here. It brings confusion, it makes familiar things feel strange, and it slowly takes away the sense of control that people rely on to feel safe. Silence plays a very important role in all of this, because Arkham is not always loud. It is not always filled with noise or chaos. And in many ways, the silence is what makes it so unsettling, because it is not a peaceful silence. It is a heavy one, a silence that feels like it is holding something back, like it is waiting. And when a place is too quiet, when the sound of your own breathing becomes the loudest thing you can hear, it can make even the smallest thought feel much bigger than it really is. And in that kind of silence, time begins to feel different, because without clear sounds or changes to mark the passing moments, everything starts to blur together, and this can make it difficult to stay grounded, difficult to remember how long you have been there, and difficult to hold on to the sense that things are moving forward, because inside Arkham, it often feels like nothing is moving at all, like everything is standing still in a way that traps not just the body, but the mind as well. For the people who live and work inside Arkham, this experience becomes something they must face every day. And while some may try to ignore it, try to focus only on their tasks and responsibilities, the environment still affects them in ways they cannot fully control. Because when someone is placed in a space where they cannot easily leave, where their movements are limited, and where their surroundings feel uncertain, it begins to change how they think, how they react, and how they understand the world around them. This is the psychological effect of confinement, and it is not always loud or obvious. It does not always appear as fear or panic, but instead often shows itself in quieter ways, in the way people become more withdrawn, more uncertain, or more focused on small details that might not matter outside those walls. And over time, these small changes can grow, slowly shaping a person's thoughts until they no longer feel the same as they once did. Disorientation adds another layer to this experience, because when someone cannot clearly understand where they are or how to move through a space with confidence, it creates a sense of instability that can be difficult to manage. And in Arkham, this is made worse by the design of the building, by the way the corridors connect, by the way rooms seem similar to one another, and by the way there are few clear markers to help guide someone from one place to another. Even the lighting can play a role in this, because it is not always steady or comforting, and small changes in brightness or shadow can make spaces feel unfamiliar, even if they have not actually changed. And this creates a kind of tension that stays with a person, making it harder for them to relax, harder for them to feel certain, and harder for them to trust their own understanding of what they see. When you combine all of these elements, the corridors that seem endless, the silence that feels heavy, the layout that creates confusion, and the lack of clear control over one's movement, Arkham begins to feel less like a place where people are kept, and more like a place that holds them in a deeper way, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And this is what makes it so difficult to escape, even for those who are not locked behind doors. The idea that a building can feel alive may sound strange at first, but in Arkham, it is not about the structure itself moving or changing in a physical way. It is about the experience it creates, the way it shapes perception, and the way it influences the thoughts of those inside it. And this influence is not something that can be easily turned off or ignored, because it is always present, always part of the environment, and always affecting the people who live within it. Over time, this creates a kind of connection between the building and the people, where the space begins to feel like an extension of their thoughts, and their thoughts begin to feel shaped by the space. And this connection makes it harder to separate what is real from what is felt, harder to understand where the building ends and where the mind begins. And this is where Arkham becomes something more than just walls and rooms. It becomes an experience that stays with a person even when they try to look away from it. And when you step back and look at all of this together, when you consider how the design, the silence, the repetition, and the lack of control all come together to create a space that feels active and present, it becomes clear that Arkham was never just a place built to hold people. It was a place that changes them, slowly and quietly, in ways that are not always easy to see, but are always there, shaping their thoughts, their feelings, and their sense of reality. In the end, the most unsettling part is not that Arkham looks different from other buildings, because on the outside, it may seem like just another structure, just another part of Gotham, but inside, it carries something much deeper, something that makes it feel alive, not in the way living things are, but in the way it affects those who enter it, in the way it surrounds them, and in the way it becomes part of their experience, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful forces are not the ones that move or speak, but the ones that simply exist, shaping everything around them without ever needing to be seen. Doctors who became patients. At first, when people think about a place like Arkham, they imagine a clear line between those who are in control and those who are not, where the doctors stand on one side with knowledge and authority, while the patients remain on the other side, watched carefully and guided through their struggles. And this idea feels simple and safe because it creates a sense that someone is always in charge, that someone understands what is happening, and that there is a structure holding everything together. But inside Arkham, that line does not stay clear for very long, and as time passes, it begins to fade in ways that are quiet, slow, and deeply unsettling. In the beginning, many of the staff arrive with strong confidence in what they do, believing that they have the training, the understanding, and the control needed to handle even the most difficult minds. And this belief gives them a sense of stability, a sense that they are separate from the chaos they are meant to manage. But Arkham is not a place that allows that separation to last, because the environment itself begins to affect them in ways they cannot fully see at first, slowly changing how they think, how they react, and how they see the people around them. The days inside Arkham do not move in a way that feels normal, because the same sounds repeat again and again. The same halls are walked over and over, and the same faces appear day after day. And while this may seem like routine, over time it creates a kind of pressure, a kind of weight that builds quietly, because repetition in a place filled with unstable minds does not bring comfort, it brings tension. It brings the feeling that nothing is moving forward, and that everything is slowly circling around the same point. For the doctors and staff, this means that their work is never truly finished, because even when progress seems to be made, even when a patient appears calm or controlled, there is always the possibility that things will change again, that the same patterns will return, and this constant uncertainty begins to wear down their sense of control, making it harder to feel confident in what they are doing, and harder to believe that their efforts are leading to real change. One of the most important things to understand is that the people inside Arkham are not just sitting. Quietly, they are thinking, observing, and reacting, and many of them are highly aware of their surroundings, aware of the staff, and aware of the ways they can influence those around them. And this creates a situation where the doctors are not simply guiding their patients, they are also being watched and studied in return. And this shift, even if it is small at first, begins to change the balance of power inside the institution. Conversations that were once clear and controlled start to feel different, because the patients may respond in unexpected ways, may ask questions that challenge the doctors, or may reflect their thoughts back at them in ways that feel uncomfortable. And over time, this creates a kind of tension where the roles begin to blur, where the doctor is no longer fully in control of the interaction, and where the patient is no longer simply receiving guidance, but actively shaping the exchange. This is how the breakdown begins, not through loud or sudden events, but through small shifts in control, small moments where the balance changes just enough to create doubt. And once that doubt is present, it can grow quickly, because the mind, especially in a place like Arkham, is already under pressure, already surrounded by uncertainty, and already exposed to thoughts and ideas that do not follow normal patterns. The longer the staff remain inside this environment, the more they are exposed to the same influences that affect the patients, because even though they are not locked behind the same doors, they are still within the same walls, still surrounded by the same atmosphere, and still part of the same system. And this means that the distance they once felt between themselves and the people they care for begins to shrink. Some may start to question their own thoughts, wondering if they are seeing things clearly or if the environment is changing their perception. And others may begin to adopt small behaviors or patterns they observe in their patients, not because they choose to, but because constant exposure makes those patterns feel familiar. And when something becomes familiar, it becomes easier to accept, even if it is not healthy. There are also moments where frustration begins to grow, because working in a place where progress is uncertain and where the same challenges return again and again can make even the most patient person feel tired. And this frustration can lead to changes in behavior, changes in how staff interact with patients, and changes in how they approach their work, sometimes becoming more strict, more distant, or even more unpredictable in their responses. As these changes build over time, the structure of Arkham begins to feel less stable, because the people who are meant to maintain order are no longer as steady as they once were. And this creates a situation where the institution itself starts to lose its sense of control, not all at once, but in small ways that add up, slowly weakening the system from within. It is also important to notice that Arkham does not push people in one clear direction. It does not affect everyone in the same way, but instead seems to find the small cracks in each person, the areas where they are already vulnerable, and slowly widen those cracks, making them harder to ignore and harder to manage. And for staff members who spend long periods inside, this can lead to a gradual shift in how they see themselves and their role. The idea of being a caretaker begins to feel less certain, because when the line between control and influence becomes unclear, it raises questions about who is really guiding the situation. And when those questions are not answered, they can lead to deeper uncertainty, making it harder for the staff to hold on to their original purpose and harder to maintain the distance that once kept them stable. Over time, this creates a pattern, a quiet but repeating pattern where some of the people who enter Arkham as doctors begin to change in ways that bring them closer to the very thing they were meant to manage. And while not everyone follows this path, the fact that it happens at all is enough to raise concern, because it suggests that the institution is not just failing to heal its patients, but is also affecting those who are meant to help. This is where the idea of doctors becoming patients begins to take shape, not always in a direct or immediate way, but as a gradual shift, a movement from one role to another that happens over time, often without a clear moment where the change can be seen. And this makes it even more unsettling, because it means that the process is not obvious. It is not something that can be easily stopped or prevented. Arkham, in this sense, does not just contain madness, it interacts with it, it reflects it, and in some ways, it spreads it, not like a sudden event, but like a slow and steady influence that touches everyone inside, shaping their thoughts and behaviors in ways that are difficult to track and even harder to control. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, when you consider how the environment, the repetition, the pressure, and the constant exposure all come together, it becomes clear that Arkham is not just a place where people are treated, but a place that changes people, both those who enter seeking help and those who enter believing they are there to provide it. In the end, the most unsettling part of this pattern is not just that it exists, but that it continues, that it repeats over time, and that it suggests something deeper about the nature of Arkham itself, because a place that slowly affects those who are meant to control it is not simply failing in its purpose, it is transforming that purpose into something else, something that blurs the line between order and chaos, and something that makes it harder to tell who is truly in control. And as the halls remain filled with quiet footsteps, as the doors continue to open and close, and as new staff arrive believing they can make a difference, the same pattern waits for them, not as a sudden threat, but as a slow and steady presence, reminding us that in Arkham, the roles people carry when they enter are not always the roles they keep, and that over time, the difference between healer and patient can become much smaller than anyone ever expected. The Joker's playground. When most people imagine a place like Arkham, they think of it as something strict and controlled, a place where doors stay locked, where rules are followed, and where the people inside are kept separate from the outside world. But there is one figure who does not see Arkham this way at all. One figure who walks through those halls and sees something completely different, and that figure is Joker, whose presence changes the meaning of Arkham in a way that is difficult to ignore and even harder to contain. For the Joker, Arkham is not a prison, not in the way it is meant to be, because a prison is supposed to limit movement, control behavior, and create order. But when he enters Arkham, he does not seem to lose control, he does not seem to feel restricted, and instead, he treats the space as if it belongs to him, as if the walls are not there to hold him in, but to frame something larger, something more like a performance than a punishment. This is where the idea of Arkham as a stage begins to take shape, because the Joker does not move through it quietly. He does not try to hide or simply wait, and instead, he acts, he performs, and he creates moments that draw attention, moments that turn even the smallest interaction into something that feels planned, something that feels like part of a larger show. And this changes the atmosphere around him, because when one person begins to treat a place as a stage, it becomes difficult for others not to become part of that performance. The halls of Arkham, which once felt heavy and silent, begin to feel different when he is present. Because the silence is no longer just quiet, it becomes something that builds anticipation, something that feels like it is waiting for something to happen. And when something does happen, it is rarely simple or predictable, because the Joker does not act in ways that follow clear patterns, and this unpredictability becomes part of the performance itself. Chaos, in his hands, is not just random or uncontrolled. It is shaped, directed, and used in a way that makes it feel almost intentional, as if every action, no matter how sudden it may seem, is part of a design that only he fully understands. And this is what makes his presence so difficult to manage, because while others may see disorder, he sees opportunity, and where others try to restore control, he finds ways to break it again. There are moments inside Arkham where things feel calm, where the routine seems to hold, where the staff move through their duties and the patients remain within their spaces. But when the Joker is involved, those moments rarely last, because he has a way of turning calm into tension, of turning stillness into movement, and of turning ordinary situations into something that feels much larger than it should. He does not need large actions to create this effect, because even small gestures, small words, or even silence itself can become part of his performance. And this is what makes him different from others, because he understands that control is not just about force, it is also about attention, about focus, and about the way people react to what they see and hear. Inside Arkham, this creates a shift in how people behave, because when someone like the Joker treats the environment as a stage, it pulls others into that same space, whether they want to be there or not. And this includes both the patients and the staff, because once the performance begins, it becomes difficult to remain outside of it, difficult to stay neutral, and difficult to ignore what is happening. The idea of violence also changes in this setting, because it is no longer just an act of harm or conflict. It becomes something that carries meaning within the performance, something that is used to send a message, to create a reaction, or to shift the direction of the moment. And this makes it feel less like random danger and more like something that is being presented, something that is being shown for a purpose. This is what makes it feel like art in a strange and unsettling way, not because it is something to admire, but because it is something that is shaped, arranged, and delivered with intention. And this intention makes it more difficult to predict, because it does not follow the usual rules of cause and effect. It follows its own pattern, its own rhythm, and its own logic that is not always clear to others. And within all of this, there is one person who stands at the center of the Joker's focus more than anyone else, and that is Batman, whose presence inside Arkham creates a connection that is both clear and deeply complicated, because their relationship is not just about conflict, it is about contrast, about reflection, and about the way each of them sees the other. When Batman enters Arkham, he does so with a purpose, with a goal to restore order, to understand what is happening, and to prevent further harm. But when the Joker sees him, he does not see just an opponent. He sees something else, something that fits into his performance, something that gives it structure, and something that allows it to continue in a way that feels complete. This connection changes the way Arkham feels when both of them are present, because it is no longer just a place of containment. It becomes a space where their interaction plays out, where their roles become more defined, and where each moment between them carries a weight that extends beyond the walls of the asylum. The Joker often speaks and acts in ways that suggest he understands Batman in a way that others do not just as a person, but as an idea, as a symbol, and this understanding allows him to shape his actions around that connection, turning their encounters into something that feels less like a fight and more like a continuation of a story that has no clear ending. Inside Arkham, this story becomes more focused, more contained, and in some ways, more intense, because the environment limits movement but not interaction, and this creates a space where every word, every glance, and every action carries more meaning, because there is less to distract from it, and more attention is placed on what is happening between them. For the staff and the other patients, this dynamic can feel confusing and unsettling, because it is not always clear where the line is between control and chaos, between performance and reality, and this uncertainty makes it harder to respond, harder to predict, and harder to maintain the structure that Arkham is meant to provide. Over time, the idea of Arkham as a stage becomes stronger, not just because of the Joker's actions, but because of the way those actions influence the space, shaping how people see it and how they experience it. And this influence does not disappear when he is not present. It lingers. It remains in the memory of what has happened, and it affects how future moments are understood. This is what makes his impact so lasting, because it is not limited to the actions themselves. It extends into the way the place is perceived, into the way people think about what might happen next, and into the way the environment feels, even when nothing is happening at all. And when you step back and look at Arkham through this perspective, it becomes clear that it is no longer just a place of confinement. It is a space where meaning is constantly being shaped and reshaped, where control is constantly being challenged, and where the line between order and chaos is always moving, always shifting, and never fully stable. In the end, the Joker's presence reveals something important about Arkham, something that may have been there from the very beginning, and that is the idea that the place is not as fixed or as controlled as it appears, that it can be influenced, redefined, and transformed by the people inside it, and that in the hands of someone who sees it differently, it can become something entirely unexpected. And as the doors continue to close and open, as the halls remain filled with quiet echoes and sudden moments of change, the idea of Arkham as a stage does not disappear. It remains, shaped by every action, every interaction, and every performance that takes place within it, reminding us that in this place, the most dangerous thing is not just what happens, but how it is understood, and how easily the meaning of it all can be changed. The silence of the cells. There are many parts of Arkham that people talk about: the long corridors, the heavy doors, the strange voices that echo at night, and the moments of sudden chaos that seem to break through without warning. But there is another side of Arkham that is often quieter, often harder to notice at first, and yet far more unsettling once you begin to understand it. And that is the silence that lives inside the isolation cells. A kind of silence that does not feel calm or safe, but instead feels heavy, as if it is holding something back, as if it is waiting, and as if it slowly presses against the people who are forced to sit within it. When someone is placed inside one of these cells, they are not surrounded by noise or distraction. They are not part of the movement of the halls, and they are not given the chance to interact in the way others might, because the purpose of isolation is to remove, to separate, and to contain. And while this may sound like a simple idea, the experience itself is anything but simple, because when a person is left alone for long periods of time, without conversation, without change, and without clear connection to the outside world, their thoughts begin to take on a different shape. At first, the silence might feel like relief, especially in a place like Arkham, where noise can often feel overwhelming, where voices overlap, and where tension fills the air. But that relief does not last, because silence, when it stretches too long, stops feeling peaceful and begins to feel empty, and that emptiness can become difficult to handle, because the human mind is not used to having nothing to hold on to, nothing to respond to, and nothing to focus on outside of itself. In that kind of space, small sounds become much louder: the sound of breathing, the slight movement of clothing, the faint shift of weight against the floor. And these sounds, while normal, begin to stand out in ways that feel unnatural, because there is nothing else to balance them. nothing else to break the stillness, and over time, even these small sounds can start to feel overwhelming, as if they are filling the entire space. But the most powerful part of isolation is not what is heard, it is what is not heard. Because without voices, without interaction, and without movement, the mind begins to turn inward, focusing on thoughts that might have once been small or easy to ignore. And as those thoughts are given more time and more space, they can begin to grow, becoming louder, more detailed, and more difficult to control. This is where the quiet horror begins to take shape, not through sudden events or visible danger, but through the slow and steady build of thoughts that have nowhere to go, thoughts that repeat, thoughts that expand, and thoughts that begin to feel more real than anything outside the cell. And this experience can change a person in ways that are not always visible from the outside, but are deeply felt within. In Arkham, this process is not always treated as something to be carefully managed or guided, because the purpose of isolation is often seen as a way to control behavior, to prevent harm, or to separate those who are considered too unstable to remain in shared spaces. But in doing so, it can also create a situation where the person inside is no longer being helped in a meaningful way, but simply being held, left alone with their thoughts and with the silence that surrounds them. There is a quiet sadness in this, because it suggests that some patients are not truly being treated, not in a way that leads to understanding or healing, but are instead being set aside, placed in a space where they are no longer part of the daily activity, no longer part of the effort to improve, and in some cases, no longer even fully remembered as individuals with their own stories and needs. Time inside these cells does not move in a way that feels clear, because without changes in the environment, without interaction, and without a sense of progress, the days begin to blur together, and it becomes difficult to tell how much time has passed, whether it has been hours or days. And this uncertainty adds another layer to the experience, making it harder to stay grounded and harder to hold on to a clear sense of reality. For some, this can lead to a kind of quiet confusion, where thoughts begin to overlap and where the difference between memory and imagination becomes less certain. And for others, it can lead to a deeper sense of withdrawal, where they begin to pull away from everything, even from their own thoughts, as a way to cope with the overwhelming stillness that surrounds them. This is what makes the silence of the cells so unsettling, because it is not just the absence of sound, it is the presence of something else, something that grows in that absence, something that fills the space in a way that is difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. And this presence can feel more intense than any noise, more powerful than any chaos, because it does not come and go, it stays, it lingers, and it continues without interruption. In a place like Arkham, where chaos is often expected, where sudden events and unpredictable actions are part of daily life, it might seem strange to say that stillness is more disturbing, but when you look closely, when you understand what happens in that stillness, it becomes clear that it carries a different kind of weight, a different kind of impact that reaches deeper into the mind. Chaos, while dangerous, is active, it moves, it changes, and it can be responded to. But stillness, especially the kind found in isolation, does not offer that same opportunity, because there is nothing to react to, nothing to interrupt the flow of thought, and nothing to pull a person out of the space they are in. And this makes it harder to escape, not physically, but mentally and emotionally. The idea that a person can be forgotten within these cells adds another layer to this experience, because when someone is no longer regularly seen, no longer part of conversation, and no longer included in the routine of the institution, it becomes easier for them to fade into the background, to become less visible, and to be treated more as a condition to be managed than as a person to be understood. And when that happens, when a person is left alone, not just physically, but also in terms of attention and care, the isolation becomes more than just a temporary measure. It becomes a state of being, something that continues without clear purpose or direction, and something that slowly removes the sense that change is possible. This is what makes the silence of the cells so powerful and so troubling, because it is not just about being alone, it is about being alone in a way that feels endless, in a way that feels disconnected from time, from people, and from progress. And this kind of experience can shape a person in ways that are difficult to reverse, because it changes how they see the world, how they understand themselves, and how they respond to everything around them. Even for those who are not inside the cells, the presence of this silence can be felt, because it becomes part of the environment, part of the atmosphere that fills the halls, and part of the understanding that within Arkham, there are spaces where nothing seems to happen, but where everything is slowly changing beneath the surface. And as the doors remain closed, as the silence continues to stretch, and as the thoughts inside those cells grow and shift without interruption, the true nature of Arkham becomes clearer, not as a place of constant chaos, but as a place where stillness can be just as powerful, just as unsettling, and just as difficult to face. In the end, the silence of the cells is not empty. It is full of thoughts, full of time, and full of the quiet changes that take place when a person is left alone for too long. And this is what makes it one of the most disturbing parts of Arkham, because it shows that sometimes the absence of noise can carry more weight than any sound, and that sometimes the most unsettling things are not the ones that move or speak, but the ones that remain still, waiting, and slowly shaping everything within their reach. Experiments in control. When people hear the word treatment, they often imagine something careful and helpful, something designed to guide a person back to a better place, where their thoughts feel clearer and their struggles feel lighter. But inside Arkham, the meaning of treatment does not always stay clear, and over time, it begins to change in ways that are not always easy to notice at first, because the line between helping and controlling slowly becomes harder to see. And once that line begins to fade, it creates space for something else to take its place. In the early days, many of the doctors and staff believed they were doing important work, believing that if they studied the mind closely enough, if they observed patterns and tested different methods, they could find ways to understand and manage even the most difficult conditions. And this belief gave them a sense of purpose, a sense that what they were doing mattered. But as time passed, that purpose began to shift, not all at once, but in small steps, where each new idea led to another, and each experiment pushed the boundaries just a little further. At first, these experiments may have seemed reasonable, involving careful observation, simple tests, and controlled environments, where patients were asked to respond to certain situations or questions. But even in these early stages, there was already a hint that something was changing, because the focus was not always on how the patient felt, but on what could be learned from them. And this shift in focus, while small, began to shape everything that followed. As more time passed, the experiments became more complex, involving both psychological and medical approaches, where patients were not just observed, but actively placed into situations designed to trigger reactions, to reveal hidden thoughts, or to test how they would respond under pressure. And while these methods were often explained as necessary for understanding, they also introduced a new kind of tension, because they required the patient to be treated not just as a person, but as a subject. This is where the idea of control becomes more visible, because these experiments were not simply about helping someone recover, they were about managing behavior, predicting outcomes, and shaping responses. And in some cases, this meant pushing patients into uncomfortable or even distressing situations, not because it would immediately help them, but because it would provide information. And this creates a difficult question about where the line should be drawn. Inside Arkham, that line does not stay fixed, and over time, it begins to move, slowly at first, where small decisions are made that seem acceptable, that seem justified in the moment. But each of these decisions adds up, creating a path that leads further away from the original goal of care and closer to something else, something that focuses more on results than on well-being. There are moments where treatments involve isolation combined with observation, where patients are placed in controlled environments and monitored closely to see how they react over time. And while this may be presented as a way to understand their condition, it can also create a sense of being watched without support, a feeling that their experience is being studied rather than guided. And this can change how they respond, making them more withdrawn or more reactive, depending on how they handle the pressure. Other approaches involve the use of medical procedures or substances designed to alter perception, to calm certain behaviors, or to bring hidden thoughts to the surface. And while these methods may have a basis in care, their use within Arkham can become more focused on control than recovery, because the goal is often to manage what is happening rather than to understand why it is happening. And this creates a gap between intention and outcome. As these methods continue, the environment of Arkham begins to reflect these changes, because when people are treated as subjects in experiments, it affects not only how they are seen, but how they see themselves. And this can lead to a loss of identity, where they begin to feel less like individuals and more like parts of a system, more like pieces in a process that they do not fully understand or control. The staff, too, are affected by this shift, because when they become used to seeing patients in this way, it changes how they approach their work, making it easier to justify actions that might once have felt uncomfortable. And this is how ethical boundaries begin to erode, not through sudden decisions, but through gradual acceptance, where each step becomes easier to take because it follows the one before it. This erosion is not always obvious, because it often happens within a system that still uses the language of care, still speaks about treatment and recovery, and still presents itself as a place meant to help. But beneath that surface, there are moments where the actions do not fully match the words, where the focus shifts toward control, toward data, and toward outcomes that may not truly benefit the person experiencing them. There is something deeply unsettling about this contrast, because it creates a situation where harm can exist alongside the idea of help, where discomfort can be explained as necessary, and where the people inside may struggle to understand whether they are being supported or simply managed. And this uncertainty can make it even harder for them to trust the system or to engage with it in a meaningful way. Over time, Arkham begins to take on a new identity, not just as a place of treatment, but as a place where control is tested, where limits are explored, and where the idea of what is acceptable slowly shifts. And this transformation is not something that happens in isolation. It is influenced by the people inside, by the pressures of the environment, and by the ongoing challenge of dealing with minds that do not follow predictable patterns. The idea of hidden cruelty comes into focus when you consider how these experiences feel from the perspective of the patients, because even if the actions are explained as part of a larger goal, the immediate experience can still be confusing, uncomfortable, or even frightening. And when those experiences are repeated without clear benefit, they begin to feel less like treatment and more like something else, something that exists within the system but is not openly acknowledged. This does not mean that every action inside Arkham is harmful or that every member of the staff intends to cause distress, because many still believe they are helping, still believe that their work is important, but the system they are part of can shape their actions in ways they may not fully see, leading them to take steps that align more with control than with care. And this creates a cycle that is difficult to break. As this cycle continues, the gap between what Arkham is meant to be and what it becomes grows wider, and the place itself begins to reflect that change, not just in its methods, but in its atmosphere, in the way it feels to those inside, and in the way it is understood by those who know its history. And when you step back and look at the full picture, when you consider how small changes over time can lead to larger shifts, it becomes clear that Arkham is not simply a place where treatment happens, but a place where the idea of treatment is constantly being reshaped, influenced by the need for control, by the pressure to understand, and by the challenges of dealing with minds that resist easy answers. In the end, what makes this part of Arkham's story so disturbing is not just the experiments themselves, but the way they fit into a larger pattern, a pattern where boundaries fade, where intentions shift, and where the line between helping and harming becomes harder to see. And this pattern reminds us that even in places built with good intentions, the path can change, slowly and quietly, until the original purpose is no longer clear, replaced by something more complicated and much more difficult to understand: the many faces of madness. When people try to understand Arkham, they often look at the building, the cells, the staff, and the systems that hold everything together. But one of the most important things to look at is the people inside it. Because Arkham is not just a place filled with individuals who have lost control, it is a place filled with ideas, beliefs, and ways of seeing the world that no longer follow the same rules as everyone else. And when you begin to look at those ideas more closely, you start to see that each person inside Arkham is not just a patient, but a reflection of a different kind of broken reality. Some of these figures stand out more than others, not just because of what they have done, but because of how they think, how they act, and how they understand the world around them. And among these figures are names that are often spoken with a mix of fear and curiosity, like Two-Face, Scarecrow, and Riddler, each one representing a different way that the mind can break, and each one showing that madness is not just one thing, but many things that take shape in very different ways. When you look at Two-Face, the first thing you notice is the clear split, the idea that everything is divided into two sides, two choices, two possible outcomes. And while this may seem simple at first, it quickly becomes more complicated, because for him, that division is not just a way of thinking, it is the only way he can understand the world. And this creates a reality where every decision must be left to chance, where control is given up completely, and where responsibility is replaced by the outcome of something as small as a coin flip. This way of thinking may seem strange, but it also reveals something deeper, because it shows how a person might try to deal with loss, with confusion, or with pain by creating a system that removes the need to choose, a system that replaces uncertainty with a kind of forced balance, even if that balance does not lead to fairness or safety. And inside Arkham, this way of thinking does not disappear. It continues, shaping how Two-Face sees everything around him and influencing how others interact with him as well. Then there is Scarecrow, whose approach to the mind is very different, because instead of trying to escape fear or avoid it, he moves directly toward it, studying it, using it, and turning it into something that can be controlled and shared. And this creates a reality where fear is not just an emotion, but a tool, something that can be shaped and delivered in ways that affect others deeply. And this makes his presence in Arkham particularly unsettling, because he understands how the mind reacts under pressure, and he knows how to create that pressure in ways that feel real and overwhelming. For Scarecrow, fear is not something to run from, it is something to explore, something to measure, and something to use as a way to understand people. And this creates a view of the world where emotions are not just experienced, but tested, and where the line between observation and harm becomes very thin, because in order to study fear, he often brings it to life in ways that others cannot easily escape. And then there is Riddler, whose reality is built around questions, puzzles, and the need to prove something, not just to others, but to himself. And this creates a pattern where everything must have a meaning, everything must have an answer, and everything must fit into a system that can be solved. And while this may sound structured, it can also become overwhelming, because the need to find answers can grow stronger and stronger, leading to actions that are driven more by the need to complete the puzzle than by the understanding of what those actions cause. In Arkham, this means that Riddler does not simply sit quietly. He thinks, he plans, and he creates challenges that reflect his view of the world. And these challenges are not always meant to harm directly, but they still create tension, still disrupt order, and still shape the environment in ways that reflect his need for control through understanding. When you place these figures together inside Arkham, something important begins to appear, because you start to see that this is not just a group of people who happen to be in the same place, but a collection of different ways of thinking, different systems of belief, and different interpretations of reality that exist side by side. And this creates a kind of environment where ideas interact, where perspectives overlap, and where the concept of what is normal becomes harder to define. Each of these individuals carries their own version of the world, their own way of understanding what is right, what is wrong, and what matters. And when those versions exist together, they do not simply cancel each other out, they create something more complex, something that feels unstable and difficult to predict, because there is no single rule that applies to all of them, no single way to guide them back to a shared understanding. This is why Arkham can feel so confusing, because it is not just holding people, it is holding philosophies, ideas about control, fear, chance, and meaning that do not align with each other. And this makes it harder for the institution to function in a clear and consistent way, because each person inside challenges the system in a different way, requiring different responses, different approaches, and different forms of control. Over time, this creates a kind of pattern where Arkham becomes less about individual treatment and more about managing a collection of conflicting realities. And this can lead to situations where the focus shifts from helping each person understand their own mind to simply maintaining order within a space that is constantly being influenced by these different ideas. There is also something important to notice about how these individuals see themselves, because they do not always view their actions as wrong or harmful, and in many cases, they see their behavior as logical, as necessary, or as part of a larger truth that others cannot see. And this makes it harder to reach them, because from their perspective, they are not lost. They are simply following a path that makes sense to them. This difference in perspective creates a gap between how they see the world and how others see it. And inside Arkham, that gap becomes part of the environment, part of the daily experience, and part of the challenge that the staff must face, because it is not just about managing behavior. It is about trying to understand a way of thinking that does not follow the same rules. And as this continues, as these different philosophies remain within the same space, Arkham begins to feel less like a place with a single purpose and more like a collection of ideas that are constantly interacting, constantly shifting, and constantly shaping the atmosphere around them. And this makes it harder to define what Arkham truly is, because it is not just a hospital, not just a prison, and not just a place of study. It is all of these things at once, influenced by the people inside it. In the end, the many faces of madness inside Arkham show that there is no single way to understand what is happening there, because each person represents a different path, a different way the mind can change, and a different way reality can be seen. And when all of these paths exist together, they create a space that is complex, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. And as the doors remain closed and the halls continue to echo with quiet footsteps and distant thoughts, the truth becomes clearer, not as something simple, but as something layered, something built from many perspectives, and something that cannot be reduced to a single explanation, reminding us that Arkham is not just a place where people are kept, but a place where different versions of reality exist side by side, shaping everything within it in ways that are both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Fear made real. There are many kinds of fear in Gotham, some that come from dark alleys and sudden danger, and some that come from the quiet thought that something is not right even when everything looks normal. But inside Arkham, fear takes on a different shape, something more controlled, something more intentional, and something that does not simply appear on its own, because there is one figure who understands fear not just as an emotion, but as something that can be studied, shaped, and released into the world. And that figure is Scarecrow, whose presence inside Arkham changes the way fear is experienced by everyone who enters its walls. Scarecrow does not treat fear as something to avoid or escape from. Because for him, fear is something to examine closely, something to break apart and understand piece by piece. And once he understands it, he finds ways to recreate it, to bring it into the minds of others in a way that feels real, even when it is not. And this is where the fear toxin becomes important, because it allows him to turn thoughts into something visible, something that can be experienced as if it were happening in front of you. When the fear toxin is used inside Arkham, it does not simply cause discomfort, it changes perception. It alters what people see, what they hear, and what they believe is happening around them. And this creates a situation where reality becomes uncertain, where the line between what is real and what is imagined begins to blur. And once that line is no longer clear, it becomes very difficult to find your way back to a sense of control. At first, someone exposed to the toxin might notice small changes, shapes that seem slightly different, sounds that feel louder or closer than they should be, or shadows that move in ways that do not match the light. And these changes may be easy to question at first, easy to dismiss as mistakes or confusion. But as the effect grows stronger, those small changes begin to build into something larger, something that feels too detailed and too intense to ignore. Hallucinations begin to take form, not as random images, but often as reflections of personal fears, memories, or thoughts that already exist within the mind. And this is what makes them so powerful, because they do not feel like something new. They feel familiar. They feel connected to something real. And this makes it harder to separate them from reality, because they are built from pieces that already belong to the person experiencing them. Inside Arkham, where the environment is already tense and uncertain, these hallucinations can become even more overwhelming, because there is little outside distraction to pull attention away from them. And this allows the experience to grow stronger, filling the space around the person, making it feel as though the entire building has changed, as though the walls themselves are reacting, shifting, or closing in. For the patients, this can be terrifying, because many of them are already struggling to understand their thoughts and their surroundings. And when those surroundings begin to change in ways they cannot control, it adds another layer of confusion, making it harder to hold on to what is real and harder to trust anything they see or hear. And this can lead to reactions that are driven by fear rather than understanding, creating moments of panic, withdrawal, or unpredictable behavior. But what makes this even more unsettling is that the staff are not always safe from this effect, because the toxin does not choose who it affects based on role or position. And when doctors, guards, or other staff members are exposed, even in small amounts, they can begin to experience the same distortions, the same shifting reality, and the same difficulty in separating what is real from what is not. This creates a situation where the structure of Arkham begins to weaken, not just because of what the patients experience, but because the people meant to maintain order are also affected. And when those in control begin to lose their sense of reality, even briefly, it becomes much harder to manage the environment, much harder to respond to situations clearly, and much harder to maintain the sense of safety that the institution is meant to provide. There are moments where someone may look down a hallway and see something that is not there, or hear a voice calling from a room that is empty. And even if they know, deep down, that something is wrong, the experience still feels real enough to cause hesitation, to cause doubt, and to slow their response. And in a place like Arkham, even a small moment of hesitation can have larger consequences. As more people are affected, the atmosphere inside Arkham begins to shift, because it is no longer just the individuals who are experiencing fear. It is the entire space that feels unstable, the entire environment that feels uncertain. And this creates a sense that the building itself has changed, even if it has not physically moved, because perception shapes experience. And when perception is altered, everything else follows. This is how Arkham begins to feel like a nightmare, not in the sense of something that happens while asleep, but in the sense of something that feels real but cannot be trusted, something where the rules no longer apply, and where the sense of control continues to slip further away the longer the experience continues. In a nightmare, there is often no clear escape, no clear way to step out and return to normal. And inside Arkham, when fear toxin spreads and hallucinations take hold, that same feeling begins to appear, because even if the doors remain the same and the structure does not change, the experience of being inside it becomes something else, something that cannot be easily understood or navigated. For those inside, this creates a kind of pressure that builds over time, because when reality itself becomes uncertain, it affects every decision, every movement, and every interaction. And this makes it harder to trust not only the environment, but also oneself. Because if what you see cannot be trusted, then your understanding of the situation becomes unstable. And this can lead to a deeper sense of fear that is not tied to any single event, but to the experience as a whole. Scarecrow's role in all of this is not just as someone who causes fear, but as someone who reveals how powerful fear can be when it is no longer hidden, when it is no longer something that stays inside the mind, but becomes something that fills the space around you, something that shapes your surroundings, and something that changes how you see everything. And this is what makes his presence inside Arkham so important, because it shows that the asylum is not just a place where fear exists, but a place where fear can be brought to life, where it can spread, and where it can influence everyone inside, regardless of their role or their purpose. Over time, as these experiences repeat, as the memory of them stays with those who have gone through them, Arkham begins to carry that fear even when the toxin is no longer present. Because once someone has experienced that level of uncertainty, that level of distortion, it becomes harder to fully trust the environment again. And this creates a lasting effect that extends beyond the moment itself. The building, the halls, and the rooms begin to feel different, not because they have changed, but because the memory of fear remains, shaping how they are seen and how they are understood. And this is what turns Arkham into something more than just a place. It turns it into an experience that stays with a person, even when the immediate danger has passed. In the end, fear inside Arkham is not just an emotion, it is something that becomes part of the environment, something that can be created, shaped, and spread, and something that can turn a place of confinement into something far more unsettling, something that feels impossible to fully escape, not because the doors cannot be opened, but because the experience itself stays with you, changing the way you see everything that comes after. The illusion of rehabilitation. When people hear that someone has been sent to Arkham, there is often a quiet belief that something will change, that time inside those walls will lead to improvement, that whatever caused the harm in the first place will be understood and corrected, and that one day, that person might return to the world outside in a better state than before. But inside Gotham, this belief does not always hold true, and over time, a pattern begins to appear. A pattern that repeats itself so often that it becomes difficult to ignore, because the same names return again and again, moving through the same cycle, entering Arkham, leaving it, and then finding their way back once more. At first, this cycle might seem like part of the process, because recovery is not always simple, and it is not always quick, and setbacks can happen. But in Gotham, the repetition feels different, because it does not seem to move forward. It does not seem to lead to lasting change, and instead, it feels like everything is returning to the same point, as if the system itself is unable to create a path that leads somewhere new. People are brought into Arkham with the idea that they will be treated, that their thoughts will be studied, and that their behavior will be guided in a way that helps them understand what has gone wrong. And for a time, there may even be signs that this is working. Moments where someone appears calmer, more controlled, or more aware of their actions. And these moments can create hope, both for the staff and for the city outside, because they suggest that change is possible. But those moments often do not last. And when the person is eventually released, when they are allowed to leave Arkham and return to Gotham, something begins to shift again, something that pulls them back toward the same patterns, the same actions. and the same path that led them to Arkham in the first place. And this raises an important question, not just about the individual, but about the environment they are returning to. Gotham itself plays a role in this cycle, because it is not a simple or stable place. It is a city filled with tension, with pressure, and with constant challenges that can affect anyone who lives there. And for someone who has already struggled with their thoughts, returning to that kind of environment can make it difficult to hold on to any progress they may have made, because the same triggers, the same influences, and the same patterns are still present, waiting for them. This creates a situation where Arkham is not just dealing with individuals, but with a larger system, a system that continues to produce the same problems over and over again. And this makes it much harder for any single effort to succeed, because even if a person changes while they are inside Arkham, the world outside may not support that change, and without that support, the progress begins to fade. There are also moments where the treatment itself does not fully address what is happening, because the focus may be on controlling behavior rather than understanding the deeper causes behind it. And while control can create temporary stability, it does not always lead to lasting change. And this means that when the control is removed, when the person is no longer within the structured environment of Arkham, the same behaviors can return, sometimes even stronger than before. The idea of rehabilitation suggests a process that leads to improvement, a path that moves forward step by step. But in Arkham, that path often feels incomplete, as if it starts but does not fully reach its end, and this creates a gap between what is expected and what actually happens. A gap that becomes more noticeable each time someone returns. Some individuals become almost known for this pattern, their names repeated in stories, their actions becoming familiar, and their presence in Arkham becoming something that feels expected rather than surprising. And this repetition can change how they are seen, not just as people who need help, but as part of a cycle that continues without clear resolution. For the staff, this can be frustrating, because it can feel like their efforts are not leading to lasting results. And this frustration can affect how they approach their work, making it harder to stay hopeful, harder to stay patient, and harder to believe that change is possible. And when that belief begins to fade, it can influence the entire system, making it less focused on recovery and more focused on managing the cycle. For the city of Gotham, this pattern becomes part of its identity, because the same figures return again and again, bringing with them the same challenges, the same conflicts, and the same sense that nothing has truly been resolved. And this can create a feeling that the city is stuck, that it is repeating the same story over and over without moving forward. This is where the idea of Arkham as a revolving door becomes clear, because instead of being a final step, a place where change happens and is carried forward, it becomes part of the cycle itself, a place that people pass through again and again, without breaking free from the pattern that brought them there in the first place. The doors open, the patients leave, and for a moment, it may seem like something has changed. But then, over time, those same doors open again, and the same people return. And this repetition creates a sense that Arkham is not solving the problem, but simply holding it for a while before releasing it back into the world. There is also something important to understand about how this cycle affects the individuals themselves, because each return can make it harder for them to see a different path, harder for them to believe that change is possible, and harder for them to break away from the identity that has formed around them. And this can create a kind of acceptance, not of healing, but of the pattern itself, where returning to Arkham becomes something expected rather than something to avoid. Over time, this can lead to a deeper connection between the person and the institution, where Arkham becomes a familiar place, not because it is comfortable, but because it is known, because it is part of their story, and because it is where they end up when the cycle completes itself once again. This connection makes the idea of rehabilitation even more complicated, because it suggests that the system is not just failing to create change, but is also reinforcing the pattern, creating a loop where each part supports the other, and where breaking free becomes more difficult with each repetition. And when you step back and look at the larger picture, when you consider how the individuals, the institution, and the city all interact, it becomes clear that the problem is not simple, and it is not contained within a single place, because Arkham and Gotham are connected in a way that makes it difficult to separate cause from effect, and this connection is what keeps the cycle moving. In the end, the illusion of rehabilitation lies in the idea that the process is complete, that the work inside Arkham leads to a clear and lasting result. But the reality shows something different, something that continues to repeat, something that returns to the same point, and something that challenges the belief that the system is truly working as it was intended. And as the doors continue to open and close, as the same figures move in and out, and as the city continues to face the same challenges, the pattern remains, not as a hidden detail, but as a clear and ongoing reality, reminding us that in Gotham, the problem is not just what happens inside Arkham, but how everything connects, and how that connection keeps the cycle alive, turning what was meant to be a solution into something that simply continues the story without ever truly ending it. Breakouts as ritual. There is a strange feeling that begins to settle in when something that should be rare starts to happen again and again, because at first, people react with shock, with urgency, and with a strong need to fix the problem. But over time, if the same event keeps repeating, that reaction begins to change, becoming slower, quieter, and almost expected. And inside Arkham, this is exactly what has happened with the breakouts, because what was once seen as a failure or an emergency has slowly turned into something that feels like part of the routine, something that fits into the rhythm of the place rather than standing outside of it. In the early days, when someone escaped from Arkham, it would cause immediate concern. Alarms would sound, guards would move quickly, and the entire institution would shift its focus towards stopping the escape and restoring order. And this response made sense, because Arkham was meant to be a place of containment, a place where dangerous individuals were kept away from the city, and any break in that containment was seen as a serious problem that needed to be corrected. But as time passed, as more escapes happened, and as the same individuals began to leave and return again and again, something began to change in the way these events were understood, because they were no longer rare, they were no longer unexpected, and they were no longer treated as something that could be fully prevented. And this shift created a new kind of pattern, where breakouts became part of the story of Arkham rather than something that interrupted it. There are moments where a breakout begins suddenly, where a door that should remain closed is found open, where a system that should remain stable begins to fail, or where a single action leads to a chain of events that spreads quickly through the building. And while each breakout may have its own details, its own causes, and its own path, the overall result is often the same, because someone leaves, chaos follows, and Arkham is left to recover once again. What makes this pattern so unsettling is not just the fact that breakouts happen, but the way they begin to feel expected, almost like a ritual that repeats itself over time, where the same steps occur in slightly different ways, but always lead back to the same outcome. And this repetition creates a sense that the system is not learning, not adapting, and not changing in a way that prevents the cycle from continuing. There are also times when the response to these breakouts feels less urgent than it once did, not because the situation is less serious, but because it has happened so many times before, and this can create a kind of quiet acceptance, where the focus shifts from preventing the breakout to managing its effects, from stopping it entirely to simply dealing with it after it occurs. And this change in focus can weaken the overall structure of the institution. This is where the idea of Arkham's inability, or perhaps even its unwillingness, to contain chaos begins to take shape. Because when a system continues to fail in the same way, without clear improvement, it raises questions about whether the problem is truly being addressed, or if it has become something that is simply part of how the system operates. Some may argue that Arkham is doing everything it can, that the challenges it faces are too complex, too unpredictable, and too difficult to fully control. And while there may be truth in that, there is also a sense that the repetition itself is a sign of something deeper, something that goes beyond individual failures and points toward a larger issue within the institution. The environment inside Arkham plays a role in this as well, because it is not a place of stability or calm. It is a place filled with tension, with conflicting ideas, and with individuals who do not follow simple patterns. And this makes it harder to maintain control, harder to predict behavior, and harder to create a system that can handle every situation effectively. At the same time, the structure of Arkham itself, with its long corridors, its isolated cells, and its layered systems of security, can create opportunities for failure, because complexity, while meant to strengthen control, can also introduce points where things can go wrong, where communication can break down, and where small issues can grow into larger problems. Each breakout, in this sense, becomes more than just an escape. It becomes a reflection of the system, a moment that reveals its weaknesses, its gaps, and its limitations. And when these moments repeat without clear resolution, they begin to shape how Arkham is seen, not just by those inside it, but by the city as a whole. For Gotham, these repeated escapes create a kind of story, a narrative that continues to build over time, where Arkham is no longer seen as a place that can fully contain danger, but as a place that tries and fails, again and again. And this perception becomes part of the city's understanding, part of how people think about safety, and part of how they respond to the idea of control. This is where the myth of Arkham's helplessness begins to form, not as something that is officially stated, but as something that grows through experience, through repetition, and through the ongoing pattern of events that seem to confirm it. And once that myth takes hold, it becomes difficult to change, because each new breakout reinforces it, adding another example, another moment that supports the idea. For the individuals inside Arkham, this pattern can also have an effect, because when breakouts become common, when they are seen as something that will happen rather than something that might happen, it can influence how they think about the institution, how they see its authority, and how they respond to its rules. And this can create a situation where control is not just weakened by events, but by perception as well. The idea that escape is possible, that it has happened before and will happen again, can become part of the mindset of those inside, shaping their actions, their plans, and their expectations. And this makes it even harder for Arkham to maintain its role as a place of containment, because the belief in its ability to contain is just as important as the systems that are meant to enforce it. There are also moments where the breakouts themselves begin to follow patterns, where certain individuals escape in ways that reflect their own methods, their own ideas, and their own understanding of the system. And this adds another layer to the cycle, because it shows that the escapes are not just random. They are influenced by the people inside, by their knowledge, and by their ability to adapt to the environment. Over time, this creates a feedback loop, where the institution influences the individuals, and the individuals, in turn, influence the institution, shaping its weaknesses, testing its limits, and contributing to the ongoing pattern of failure and response that defines the experience of Arkham. And as this loop continues, as each breakout leads to another, and as each response leads back to the same starting point, the sense of routine becomes stronger, not in a way that brings comfort, but in a way that brings resignation, a feeling that this is how things are, and that changing it is more difficult than anyone expected. In the end, the idea of breakouts as ritual is not about a planned event or a deliberate pattern, but about the way repetition shapes understanding, about how something that should be rare becomes common, and about how that change affects the way people see the system, the place, and the possibility of control. And as the gates continue to close behind those who return, as the halls fill once again with quiet footsteps and distant echoes, and as the city watches and waits for the next moment when the pattern repeats, the truth becomes harder to ignore, because Arkham is no longer just a place that struggles to contain chaos. It is a place where chaos has become part of its rhythm, part of its identity, and part of the story that continues to unfold without a clear end. Batman inside Arkham, there are moments when even the strongest figures must step into places that test them in ways they did not expect. And for Batman, Arkham is one of those places, not just because it holds the people he has faced again and again, but because it reflects something back at him, something that is not always easy to accept. And when he walks through its halls, he is not just entering a building filled with danger, he is stepping into a space where his own thoughts, his own choices, and his own identity are quietly examined by everything around him. At first, Batman enters Arkham with a clear purpose, as he often does, focused, controlled, and aware of what needs to be done. Because outside of Arkham, he moves with certainty, with a strong sense of direction, and with a belief that his actions serve a greater goal. But inside Arkham, that sense of certainty begins to shift, not because he loses control, but because the environment itself begins to challenge the way he sees things. The halls of Arkham are not just filled with patients, they are filled with people who know him, who understand him in ways that others do not, and who have spent time thinking about him, studying him, and building their own ideas about what he represents. And this creates a situation where Batman is no longer just an observer or a force of control. He becomes part of the environment, part of the interaction, and part of the story that is unfolding within those walls. Some of the inmates see him not as a hero, but as something else, something closer to themselves than he might be willing to admit. And this idea is not always spoken directly, but it is present in the way they talk to him, in the way they react to him, and in the way they challenge his understanding of his own role. Because for them, the line between what he is and what they are is not as clear as it might seem from the outside. There are moments where Batman listens, where he allows the conversation to continue, and in those moments, the words of the inmates can carry a weight that is difficult to ignore, because they do not always speak in simple terms. They speak in ways that reflect their own understanding of the world, and that understanding often includes him, placing him within their view of reality rather than outside of it. This is where his psychological vulnerability begins to show, not in a way that makes him weak, but in a way that makes him human, because being exposed to these perspectives, to these reflections, can create doubt, can raise questions, and can bring forward thoughts that are not always easy to answer, especially in a place like Arkham, where the environment itself already challenges perception and control. The idea that he might share something with the people inside Arkham is not something he easily accepts, but it is something that appears again and again, in different forms, through different voices, and through different interactions. And this repetition makes it harder to ignore, because it suggests that the connection is not random, but part of a larger pattern. When you look at the people inside Arkham, you see individuals who have taken their thoughts and their actions to extremes, who have followed their ideas without stopping, and who have allowed their understanding of the world to shape everything they do. And when they look at Batman, they see someone who has also chosen a path, who has also shaped his life around a single idea, and who continues to follow that idea without stepping away. This similarity does not mean that they are the same, but it creates a connection that cannot be fully dismissed, because both sides are driven by strong beliefs, both sides act with purpose, and both sides exist within the same space, responding to the same city, and influenced by the same environment. Inside Arkham, this connection becomes more visible because the distance that exists outside is reduced, the roles are brought closer together, and the interactions become more direct, more focused, and more intense. And this makes it harder for Batman to remain fully separate from the ideas being presented to him. There are moments where the inmates speak as if they understand him completely, as if they can see through the mask and recognize something deeper, something that connects him to them. And even if Batman does not agree with these views, the fact that they exist, the fact that they are repeated, and the fact that they are spoken with confidence can create a kind of pressure, a kind of weight that stays with him as he moves through the space. This is what makes Arkham different from any other place he enters, because it is not just a location where he confronts danger, it is a place where he confronts reflection, where the people inside act as mirrors, showing him versions of himself that he may not want to see, and asking questions that do not have simple answers. The environment itself adds to this experience, because the quiet halls, the heavy silence, and the constant presence of those who think differently all combine to create a space where thoughts feel louder, where questions feel heavier, and where the usual sense of control is harder to maintain, not because it is gone, but because it is being challenged from multiple directions at once. For Batman, who is used to moving through the city with purpose and clarity, this can be unsettling because it requires him to slow down, to listen, and to consider ideas that do not fit easily into his understanding of right and wrong. And this creates a kind of internal tension where he must hold on to his purpose while also facing the possibility that things are more complicated than they appear. The idea that he might belong in Arkham, that he might be part of the same pattern as those he brings there, is one of the most unsettling thoughts that emerges in this environment, because it challenges the foundation of his identity, the belief that he stands apart, that he exists outside of the chaos he confronts, and that his role is clear and justified. This idea is not presented as a simple statement, but as a question, a suggestion, and a reflection that appears in different forms, through different voices, and through different moments. And each time it appears, it invites him to consider it, even if only briefly, even if only to reject it. But even rejection requires thought, and thought requires attention, and attention gives the idea space to exist. And this is how Arkham works, not by forcing answers, but by creating questions that stay with you, questions that return later, and questions that continue to shape how you see things, even after you leave. There is also something important to understand about how Batman responds to this, because he does not simply accept what he hears, and he does not lose his sense of purpose, but he also does not ignore the complexity of the situation, because he understands that the world he moves through is not simple, and that the line between control and chaos is not always clear. This understanding allows him to continue, to move forward, and to maintain his role, but it also means that he carries the weight of these questions with him, that he does not leave Arkham unchanged, and that each visit adds something to his experience, something that shapes how he sees the city, the people within it, and himself. And when you step back and look at this larger picture, it becomes clear that Arkham is not just a place where Batman brings others, it is a place that affects him as well, a place that challenges him in ways that go beyond physical confrontation, and a place that forces him to face the deeper questions behind his actions. In the end, the most unsettling part is not whether he truly belongs there, but the fact that the question can be asked at all, because the existence of that question suggests that the difference between him and the people inside Arkham is not as simple as it may seem, and that the line that separates them, while still present, is thinner than anyone might want to admit. And as he walks through those halls, as the doors open and close behind him, and as the voices of the inmates continue to echo in the quiet space, the reflection remains, not as a clear answer, but as a lingering thought, a reminder that even the strongest figures are not outside the influence of the world they move through, and that in a place like Arkham, everyone who enters becomes part of the story, whether they choose to or not. The asylum's influence on Gotham. When people think about Arkham, they often picture it as a place that stands apart from the rest of the city, a place surrounded by walls, gates, and distance, something separate that exists to keep danger contained and away from everyday life. But the truth is much more complicated than that, because Arkham does not stay within its walls, not in the way people expect, and over time, its presence begins to reach far beyond its physical boundaries, slowly shaping the city around it in ways that are not always easy to notice at first. Gotham is already a place filled with tension, with shadows, and with stories that do not always have clear endings. But Arkham adds something deeper to that feeling, something that changes how people see the city and how they understand the risks that come with living there. Because Arkham is not just a building, it is an idea, a symbol of everything that cannot be easily fixed. And once that idea becomes part of the city's identity, it begins to influence how people think and how they act. There are moments when someone walks through Gotham at night, passing by quiet streets and dim lights, and even if nothing is happening, there is still a feeling that something could happen, something unexpected, something that might come from anywhere. And part of that feeling comes from the knowledge that Arkham exists, that within its walls are people who have already crossed certain lines, and that those people do not always stay contained. This awareness creates a kind of background tension that follows people through their daily lives, not always strong enough to stop them from moving forward, but always present in a quiet way, shaping how they look at their surroundings, how they respond to unfamiliar situations, and how they think about safety. Because when a place like Arkham exists, it changes what people consider possible. Over time, this influence becomes part of Gotham's identity, because the stories that come from Arkham, the escapes, the returns, and the repeated cycle of events, all contribute to the way the city is understood, both by those who live in it and by those who hear about it from a distance. And this creates a connection between the asylum and the city that goes beyond location, forming a link that shapes how both are seen. People begin to expect a certain level of unpredictability, a certain level of danger, and a certain level of uncertainty. And this expectation becomes part of daily life, not always spoken about directly, but present in the way people move, in the way they plan, and in the way they react when something unusual happens. Because in Gotham, unusual events are not rare, they are part of the pattern. Arkham plays a central role in this pattern because it is both a source and a reflection of what the city faces, holding individuals who represent extreme versions of the same challenges that exist outside its walls. And when those individuals return to the city, they bring with them the same ideas, the same actions, and the same impact, reinforcing the connection between the two. This creates a situation where Arkham is not just influencing Gotham through events, but also through perception, because the idea of Arkham shapes how people understand the city, making it feel more uncertain, more complex, and more difficult to fully control. And this perception becomes part of how Gotham is defined. Fear begins to spread in subtle ways, not always through direct events, but through the knowledge that those events are possible. And this kind of fear is different from sudden danger, because it does not appear and disappear quickly. It stays, it lingers, and it becomes part of the way people think, influencing their decisions, even when nothing is happening at the moment. A person might choose a different route home, might avoid certain areas, or might react more quickly to something that feels out of place. And while these actions may seem small, they are part of a larger pattern, a pattern shaped by the ongoing presence of Arkham and the stories that come from it. Even the way people talk about the city reflects this influence, because Arkham is often mentioned not just as a location, but as a symbol, something that represents the deeper issues that Gotham faces, something that reminds people that the problems are not always simple, and that they are not always solved in a clear or lasting way. Over time, this connection becomes so strong that it becomes difficult to separate the city from the asylum, because each one reflects the other, each one influences the other, and each one plays a role in shaping the experience of those who live there, creating a cycle that continues without a clear point where it begins or ends. There are also moments when the presence of Arkham changes how people see those who struggle, because instead of being viewed as individuals with their own stories and challenges, they may be seen through the lens of the asylum, associated with the same patterns and the same expectations. And this can create a kind of distance, a lack of understanding that makes it harder to address the deeper issues that exist. In this way, Arkham does not just influence the city through events, but also through the way it shapes understanding, shaping how people think about behavior, about risk, and about the possibility of change. And this influence can make it harder to move beyond the cycle because it reinforces the same patterns again and again. Gotham begins to feel like an extension of Arkham, not in a physical sense, but in the way it carries the same themes, the same challenges, and the same sense of uncertainty. And this creates a situation where the boundaries between the two become less clear, where the influence flows in both directions, and where the idea of containment becomes harder to maintain. The streets of Gotham, with their shifting moods and constant activity, reflect the same instability that exists within Arkham's walls, and the people who move through those streets are influenced by the same pressures, the same environment, and the same ongoing cycle that defines the asylum, creating a connection that is not easily broken. Even for those who have never stepped inside Arkham, its presence can still be felt, because it is part of the city's story, part of its identity, and part of the way it is understood. And this means that its influence reaches far beyond its walls, shaping experiences in ways that are not always visible, but always present. And as this influence continues, as the stories repeat, and as the connection between Arkham and Gotham grows stronger, it becomes clear that the two cannot be fully separated, because each one supports the other, each one reflects the other, and each one contributes to the ongoing pattern that defines the city. In the end, the most unsettling part is not just that Arkham affects Gotham, but that Gotham reflects Arkham in return, creating a loop where the same ideas, the same fears, and the same patterns continue to move between them, shaping everything within their reach and making it difficult to imagine one without the other. And as the city continues to move, as the lights remain on and the streets remain filled, the presence of Arkham stays just beneath the surface, not always visible, but always there, influencing how people think, how they act, and how they understand the world around them, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful influence is not something that stands apart, but something that becomes part of everything, quietly shaping it from within. The endless cycle. There is a feeling that slowly grows when you look at Gotham for a long time. A feeling that things are moving but not really changing. A feeling that events happen again and again with different faces but the same outcome. And this feeling becomes even stronger when you begin to notice how Arkham fits into all of it. Because Arkham is not just a place where things end, it is also a place where things begin again. And this creates a pattern that feels less like a line moving forward and more like a circle that keeps returning to the same point. At first, the idea of change seems real because each story is different. Each person has their own past, their own reasons, and their own path that led them to where they are. And this makes it feel like something new is always happening, like each moment is separate from the one before it. But when you look closer, when you step back and see the larger picture, you begin to notice that the same themes appear again and again, the same struggles, the same choices, and the same outcomes that bring people into Arkham and then send them back out into the city once more. This is where the idea of madness repeating across generations begins to take shape, because it is not just the same individuals returning, it is also new individuals stepping into the same roles, following similar paths, and becoming part of the same pattern, even if their stories begin in different ways. And this creates a sense that the problem is not limited to one time or one group of people, but is something that continues, something that moves forward while still staying the same. There are moments when an older figure disappears, when someone who has been part of Gotham's story for a long time is no longer present. And for a short time, it may seem like something has changed, like the cycle has been broken. But then, slowly, someone else appears, someone new, someone different, but carrying the same kind of energy, the same kind of thinking, and the same kind of role. And this new figure begins to take the place of the one before, continuing the pattern rather than ending it. This replacement does not happen in an obvious way, because each new person brings their own style, their own ideas, and their own way of acting. But the structure around them remains the same, the city remains the same, and the system that responds to them remains the same. And this creates a situation where the details change, but the outcome does not. And this is what makes the cycle feel endless. Arkham stands at the center of this pattern, not just as a place where people are held, but as a place where the cycle becomes visible, because it is where the paths of these individuals come together, where their stories pause before continuing again, and where the repetition becomes easier to see, because the same movement in and out continues without clear resolution. The idea of a loop becomes clearer when you think about how this works, because a loop does not move forward in a straight line. It returns to the same point again and again, and in Gotham, that point often leads back to Arkham, where the same steps are followed, where the same process takes place, and where the same result is reached. Even if the details along the way are slightly different, this creates a sense that the system itself is part of the problem, not just the individuals within it. Because if the same pattern continues despite different people, different times, and different situations, then it suggests that something deeper is holding it in place. Something that does not change, even when everything else does. The environment of Gotham plays a role in this, because it continues to create the same pressures, the same challenges, and the same conditions that allow this pattern to exist. And Arkham, as part of that environment, becomes a place where those conditions are managed rather than resolved, where the cycle is paused rather than broken. There is also something important to understand about how this affects the people involved, because when someone becomes part of this pattern, when they move through Arkham and then return to the city, they are not just repeating their actions, they are also reinforcing the system, becoming part of the loop that continues to move forward without change. Over time, this can create a sense of inevitability, a feeling that things will happen the same way no matter what is done. And this feeling can influence how people respond, how they plan, and how they think about the possibility of change. Because if the outcome always seems to return to the same point, it becomes harder to believe that a different result is possible. For those inside Arkham, this can make the idea of recovery feel distant, because even if they change, even if they understand their actions, the system around them remains the same. And this makes it difficult to step outside the pattern, because the path that leads back is always there, always waiting, and always easy to follow. For those outside, this pattern can create a sense of familiarity with danger, where the presence of these figures becomes expected, where their actions become part of the city's rhythm, and where the response to them becomes routine. And this can weaken the sense of urgency, making it feel like part of everyday life, rather than something that needs to be fully resolved. Arkham, in this sense, becomes more than just a place. It becomes a part of the cycle itself, a point that everything returns to, and a point that everything moves away from, without ever truly escaping it. And this makes it difficult to see where the cycle could be broken, because every part of it is connected to every other part. The idea that this loop cannot be broken is one of the most unsettling parts of Arkham's story, because it suggests that the system is not moving toward a solution, but continuing in a pattern that repeats without clear progress. And this raises questions about whether the problem is being addressed at its core, or simply managed in a way that allows it to continue. There are moments where it seems like something might change, where a new approach is taken, where a new idea is introduced, or where a new effort is made to break the pattern. But those moments often return to the same place, not because they are not meaningful, but because the larger system remains the same. And without changing that system, the cycle continues. And as this continues, as each new story follows the same path, as each new figure steps into a role that has already been defined, and as each return to Arkham reinforces the pattern once again, the loop becomes stronger, more established, and more difficult to challenge, because it is no longer just a series of events, It is a structure that supports itself. In the end, the endless cycle is not just about repetition, it is about connection, about how each part of Gotham and Arkham works together to maintain the pattern, and about how that pattern continues even when individuals change, because the structure remains the same. And as the doors of Arkham continue to open and close, as the city continues to move through its days and nights, and as new stories begin only to follow the same path as the ones before, the loop remains, not as something hidden, but as something clear, something that defines the experience of Gotham, and something that reminds us that sometimes the most difficult problems are not the ones that appear suddenly, but the ones that continue quietly, repeating again and again without ever truly ending. The quiet truth of Arkham. There is a moment that comes after you have seen enough of Arkham, after you have followed its stories, watched the people who pass through its doors, and listened to the quiet way it continues to exist without truly changing. And in that moment, something begins to settle in, something that feels simple at first, but grows heavier the more you think about it. And that is the quiet truth that Arkham may not be what it was meant to be, not a place where people are healed and made whole again, but something else entirely, something that exists not to fix what is broken, but to hold it, to contain it, and to keep it from spreading too far for a time. At first, this idea can be difficult to accept, because the purpose of Arkham is often spoken about in hopeful terms, as a place of treatment, as a place of recovery, and as a place where people can find their way back. But when you look closely at what actually happens, when you follow the paths of those who enter and leave, and when you see how often those paths lead back to the same place, it becomes harder to hold onto that belief, because the pattern suggests something different, something quieter, and something much more unsettling. The people inside Arkham do not always change in the way that is expected, and even when they do, even when there are moments of calm or understanding, those moments often do not last, because the system around them remains the same. The environment they return to remains the same, and the deeper issues that shaped their path are not fully removed. And this creates a situation where the idea of cure begins to feel distant, almost unreachable. Instead of cure, what Arkham seems to offer is management, a way to keep things under control for a time, a way to reduce immediate danger, and a way to create a sense of order within a space that is otherwise difficult to control. And while this may be necessary in the moment, it does not solve the larger problem. It does not remove the root of what is happening, and it does not prevent the pattern from continuing. This idea of management over cure becomes clearer when you consider how often the same individuals return, how often the same behaviors reappear, and how often the same outcomes are reached. Because if something is truly being healed, it should lead to lasting change. It should move forward, and it should not return to the same point again and again. And yet, in Arkham, that return is part of the pattern. There is also something important to understand about the nature of madness itself, because it is not always something that can be easily removed or corrected. It is often tied to deeper experiences, deeper thoughts, and deeper ways of seeing the world. And these things do not disappear simply because someone is placed in a different environment, because they are part of how that person understands everything around them. This makes the idea of cure even more complicated, because it suggests that what Arkham is dealing with is not something that can be fixed in a simple or direct way, but something that must be managed over time, something that must be contained rather than removed. And this shifts the role of Arkham from a place of healing to a place of control. But even this control is not complete, because as time has shown, as stories have repeated, and as patterns have continued, Arkham does not fully contain what it holds. It pauses it, it holds it for a time, and then, eventually, it releases it back into the city, where the cycle begins again. And this creates a loop that is difficult to break, because each part supports the other. When you look at Gotham itself, you begin to see how closely it is connected to Arkham, because the same themes, the same challenges, and the same patterns that exist within the asylum also exist within the city, not in exactly the same way, but in ways that reflect each other, shaping the environment and influencing the people who live there. Gotham is not a place of simple answers. It is a place of constant movement, constant tension, and constant change, and this creates conditions where the same kinds of struggles can grow, where the same kinds of paths can form, and where the same outcomes can appear, leading people toward Arkham as part of that process. This connection makes it difficult to see Arkham as something separate, because it is not isolated from the city. It is part of it, part of its structure, part of its identity, and part of the way it continues to function. And this means that what happens inside Arkham cannot be fully understood without also looking at what happens outside. The idea that Arkham is Gotham becomes clearer when you think about how they reflect each other, how the same patterns appear in both, and how the movement between them continues without clear separation. Because the people who enter Arkham come from Gotham, and the people who leave Arkham return to Gotham, carrying with them the same thoughts, the same experiences, and the same influence. This movement creates a connection that is not just physical, but conceptual, where the two places become part of the same system, part of the same cycle, and part of the same story. And this makes it difficult to say where one ends and the other begins, because they are constantly interacting, constantly shaping each other, and constantly reinforcing the pattern that defines them both. There is a quiet weight to this realization, because it suggests that the problem is not contained within a single place, not limited to a single group of people, and not something that can be fixed by focusing on one part alone, because the system itself is larger than that, and it requires a deeper understanding to truly change. For those who look at Arkham and hope for a clear solution, this can be difficult to accept, because it challenges the idea that there is a simple answer, that there is a clear path forward, and that the problem can be solved in a way that brings lasting peace. But the reality suggests something more complex, something that requires ongoing effort, ongoing attention, and a willingness to face the deeper issues that exist beneath the surface. And yet, even within this complexity, there is still meaning, still purpose, and still value in the effort to manage what cannot be fully cured. Because even if the cycle continues, even if the pattern repeats, the act of holding, of controlling, and of responding still matters, because it shapes how the cycle unfolds, even if it does not fully end it. Arkham, in this sense, becomes a place that reflects both the limits and the possibilities of what can be done, showing that while some problems may not have simple solutions, they can still be faced, still be understood, and still be managed in ways that reduce harm and create moments of stability within the larger pattern. In the end, the quiet truth of Arkham is not loud or dramatic. It does not appear in sudden moments or clear events, but in the steady repetition of the cycle, in the way the same patterns continue, and in the way the connection between Arkham and Gotham remains strong, shaping everything that happens within them. And as the city continues to move, as the asylum continues to stand, and as the stories continue to unfold, the realization remains, not as something that changes everything at once, but as something that slowly becomes clear over time, reminding us that Arkham is not separate from Gotham, not something outside of it, but something that exists within it as part of its structure, part of its identity, and part of the ongoing story that continues without a clear end. And now, as our quiet journey through Arkham slowly comes to an end, the heavy doors seem to close once more, not with force, but with a soft and distant stillness, as if the stories we uncovered are gently settling back into the shadows where they have always lived. The halls grow silent again, the echoes fading into something softer, something calmer, until even the weight of it all begins to feel far away, like a memory drifting just beyond reach. Gotham, too, seems to quiet, its restless movement slowing beneath the dim glow of distant lights, as though the city itself is taking a breath, releasing the tension it has been carrying for so long. The patterns we followed, The cycles that once felt endless begin to soften, no longer sharp or pressing, but distant, like waves fading into the horizon. And here, in this stillness, there is nothing left to solve, nothing left to follow, only the quiet understanding that some stories are not meant to end, but simply to rest. And as the night settles gently around you, you may now rest with it.